She was donated blood to a dying stranger, unaware he was her ex-billionaire husband. "Hi, I'm Selena from Heartwoven Tales. I have a question for you. Where are you listening to me from right now? I want you to imagine this. A woman donates her blood to save a dying stranger, only to realize that stranger is her ex-husband, the billionaire who vanished from her life 5 years ago without a word. The secrets, the betrayal, the danger. It's all here, and every second is a twist you won't see coming. I created this story to show love, courage, and revenge like you've never heard before. So stay with me till the very end. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now let's dive in. Chicago Memorial Hospital had learned how to function under pressure, but nights like this still tested its bones. The blizzard outside had turned the city into something unrecognizable, and the wind coming off Lake Michigan hit the building so hard that even the reinforced glass trembled, sending a low vibration through the walls that staff felt in their feet long before they heard it. Raina had been on her feet for nearly 11 hours when the emergency alarm shifted tone, that subtle but unmistakable change that told experienced nurses this was no routine trauma. She didn't need the overhead announcement to know something was wrong. She saw it in the way doctors moved faster without speaking, and in the way a junior nurse froze for half a second before forcing herself forward. When Raina stepped into the trauma bay, the smell of blood and melting snow clung to the air, and the patient was still being transferred, his clothes already cut away, his body marked with bruises and fresh wounds that told a clear story of violent impact. A physician rattled off injuries in a flat voice meant to stay calm, even when the outcome was uncertain. And then he paused just long enough for the room to register the real problem. "Blood type is Rh null," he said, not raising his voice, but the effect was immediate. Someone muttered under their breath. Someone else checked the blood bank screen again, even though they already knew the result, and the tension thickened because Rh null wasn't rare in the way people like to exaggerate. It was rare in the way that left no backup plan. Raina didn't announce herself dramatically or wait to be asked. She simply said, "I'm registered." And when the doctor looked at her, she added, "I'm the only donor in the city." There was no applause, no hesitation, just movement, consent forms pushed toward her, a nod from the attending, and security appearing at the doorway without explanation. Men whose posture didn't belong in a hospital. As she lay back on the donor bed, cold seeping through her scrubs, Raina focused on the ceiling the way she always did, keeping her breathing even, listening to fragments of conversation that didn't include her, but mattered anyway. Words like VIP, no records, and keep this contained, which told her the patient's life carried weight far beyond this room. The needle entered her arm cleanly, practiced and efficient, and she watched her blood begin to flow through the tubing, dark and steady, toward the man whose name she still didn't know, reminding herself that blood was blood, that bodies didn't care about status, that this was just medicine doing what it was supposed to do. She turned her head to check the monitors herself, not because she didn't trust the staff, but because staying busy kept her grounded. And that was when everything shifted. His face was partially obscured by swelling and the oxygen mask, but his hand rested exposed near the rail, scraped and bruised, and on his right thumb was a scar so familiar that her body reacted before her mind did. Her breath caught hard, sharp enough that the donor tech noticed, asking quietly if she felt lightheaded, and Raina answered automatically that she was fine even as her eyes stayed locked on that small, star-shaped mark. She knew exactly when that scar had happened, knew the sound of breaking glass and the way he'd laughed it off at their wedding reception while she wrapped his hand with whatever cloth she could find, telling him he'd better not bleed on her dress, telling him he owed her a lifetime for ruining the moment, and hearing him promise it without hesitation. Her heart began to pound in a way that had nothing to do with blood loss, and she pushed herself upright despite protocol, stepping closer to the bed until the truth became unavoidable. The shape of his jaw, the faint crease between his brows, even in unconsciousness, the familiarity she had tried for years to bury, all of it lined up into something she couldn't deny. "No," she said under her breath, not loudly enough for anyone else to hear, because saying it out loud felt dangerous. This wasn't just a patient. This was Peter, her husband, the man who had walked out of their apartment 5 years ago with a single bag and no explanation, leaving behind silence so complete it had rewritten her life. She didn't cry because shock didn't give her permission to fall apart. Instead, she leaned into the work, adjusting the IV, checking his pupils, forcing her hands to remain steady while her thoughts refused to cooperate. Someone commented that his pressure was stabilizing, and Raina nodded as if she'd just heard good news, even though all she could think was that her blood was keeping alive the man who had never once explained why he left. She leaned closer, lowering her voice, not caring anymore whether it was appropriate. "You don't get to come back like this," she said quietly, her words tight and controlled. "You don't disappear and then land on my table bleeding." She noticed the watch on his wrist, expensive and cracked, and the sight of it made something inside her harden because it didn't belong to the man she remembered, the man who used to say time was the one thing money couldn't buy. "So you figured that out," she added, not kindly, before straightening as a nurse asked if she knew the patient. "No," Raina answered too quickly because the truth felt too big to handle in a room full of strangers. The storm outside intensified, wind howling like it had something to say, and the lights flickered once, just enough to spike her awareness before settling again. Raina leaned back toward him, keeping her voice low, her tone steady, the way she spoke to patients who hovered between waking and slipping away. "Why did you leave?" she asked, knowing there would be no answer but needing to ask anyway. "If this is how you come back, it's not fair." His chest rose unevenly beneath the machines, and for a moment she convinced herself she was imagining the tension in the room, the way the air felt charged, stretched thin. Then his fingers moved, just slightly at first, enough that she noticed but dismissed it as a reflex, until his hand suddenly closed around her wrist with startling strength, gripping her hard enough to make her gasp. The monitors reacted immediately, alarms sounding, voices rising, someone calling for the doctor. But Raina didn't pull away. She stared at their joined hands, his scar pressed against her skin, feeling the weight of that contact sink in. "Peter," she said without thinking, his name breaking free after 5 years of silence. And even though his eyes remained closed, his grip tightened like he recognized her, like he'd been reaching for something familiar in the dark. The room moved around them, staff responding, instructions being shouted, but Raina stood frozen in that moment, her blood flowing into him, his hand refusing to let go, and the realization settling deep in her chest that whatever had brought him here tonight was not finished with either of them. The alarm slowly settled after the chaos of Peter's sudden movement, and the trauma bay shifted back into controlled urgency. But Raina could feel the change before she saw it, the subtle tightening of the room that had nothing to do with medicine. The doors didn't burst open dramatically. They opened with quiet authority, and men in dark suits stepped inside as if they owned the space, their shoes too clean, their eyes too alert for people who were merely concerned. Raina noticed immediately how the doctors adjusted their tone, how a nurse lowered her voice mid-sentence, how someone instinctively reached up and turned the patient's name display off before it could be read. One of the men, tall and rigid, spoke just loud enough to be heard. "We'll need the room secured." It wasn't a request. Curtains were pulled, security posted at every exit, and within minutes the trauma bay felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had leaned in. Raina stood near Peter's bed, her wrist still tingling where he'd held her, watching as his care stopped being about survival and started being about control. The attending physician cleared his throat and said, "The transfusion stabilized him." And for a brief moment, Raina felt relief, but it faded quickly when she realized no one was looking at her anymore. They were looking past her, around her, like she was already part of the furniture. A man stepped forward from the group, older than the others, hair perfectly combed, expression set into something that might have passed for polite if you didn't look too closely. He held a leather folder under his arm like it weighed nothing. "I'm Marcus Hale," he said, extending a hand that Raina didn't take. "I represent Mr. Peter Caldwell." The name hit her harder than she expected, hearing it spoken so formally, stripped of the familiarity it once carried. Marcus didn't seem to notice her reaction or chose not to. He gestured slightly, and one of the guards leaned in to whisper to the attending, who nodded reluctantly before turning to Raina. "You're relieved from this case," the doctor said, not meeting her eyes. Raina felt heat rise in her chest. "Excuse me?" she replied, keeping her voice even. Marcus smiled then, thin and measured, the kind of smile designed to close deals, not comfort people. "Miss," he said, "your contribution has been noted and appreciated. However, effective immediately, Mr. Caldwell's medical records are restricted. Full blackout." Raina stared at him. "You don't get to decide that," she said. "This is a hospital, not a boardroom." Marcus finally looked directly at her, his eyes assessing, calculating. "This patient is no longer just a patient," he replied calmly. "He is a significant economic entity. His well-being affects more people than you realize." They moved her out of the trauma bay with practiced efficiency, not roughly, not unkindly, but firmly enough that resistance felt useless. Raina found herself standing at a desk just outside the secured wing, while Marcus placed the leather folder in front of her and opened it with deliberate care. Inside was a thick stack of papers, dense with legal language, and on top, clipped neatly, was a check. The number on it made her blink once before she forced herself not to look again. "That's a non-disclosure agreement," Marcus said, as if he were explaining a menu. $1 million. In exchange for your silence regarding tonight's events, the patient's identity, and any personal connections you may believe you have. Raina let out a short, humorless laugh. "Believe I have?" she asked. Marcus's smile didn't change. "Peter Caldwell is a billionaire real estate developer," he continued. "His accident is already being monitored at levels far above this hospital. What you know, or think you know, could cause unnecessary complications." Raina pushed the folder back toward him without touching the check. "I don't want your money," she said. Her voice didn't shake, but something sharp lived underneath it. "I want answers." Marcus studied her for a moment, then said, "Answers are rarely free." She leaned forward slightly. "Then start talking," she replied. "Because 5 years ago, that man walked out of my life without a word, and tonight I kept him alive with my blood. If anyone has earned the right to be here, it's me." For the first time, Marcus's smile slipped, just a fraction. He glanced toward the secured doors, then back at her. "Personal history complicates things," he said carefully, "which is precisely why this document exists." Raina shook her head. "I'm not signing anything," she said, "and I'm not leaving his care." A silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Marcus closed the folder slowly. "You don't understand the risks," he said. "People don't just have accidents like this." Raina's eyes narrowed. "So it wasn't an accident," she said, and watched him realize he'd said too much. He straightened. "I didn't say that." Raina stood up fully now. "You don't get to erase me," she said quietly. "Not again." Around them, staff pretended not to listen, but the tension was obvious. After a long pause, Marcus spoke again, his voice lower. "He requested that you not be informed of his affairs," he said, "of his life." Raina felt that land, felt the old hurt flare, but she didn't step back. "Then he shouldn't have come here," she answered, "and he shouldn't have needed my blood." Marcus studied her another moment, then nodded once, sharp and final. "You may remain as primary nurse," he said. "For now." The words carried weight, threat disguised as permission. Raina didn't thank him. She turned and walked back into the secured wing, past guards who watched her too closely, back to Peter's bedside. He lay still now, machines doing their work, his face calmer than it had been when he arrived. She adjusted his blanket, checked his vitals, and tried to ignore the way her chest tightened looking at him like this. When the shift quieted, when the guards relaxed just enough to look bored, Raina retrieved the coat that had been cut from his body earlier, intending to inventory it for personal effects like she'd done 1,000 times before. The fabric was stiff with dried blood, heavy in her hands. She checked the pockets methodically until her fingers brushed against something tucked deep inside the lining. She frowned and reached in, pulling out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. Her breath stopped. It was her, unmistakably standing outside her apartment building, keys in hand, unaware. The timestamp on the corner was from yesterday. Raina stared at it, her pulse pounding, the room suddenly too quiet, because whatever story Peter had been running from 5 years ago had never really let her go. The photograph stayed in Raina's pocket long after she slipped Peter's blood-stained coat back into the evidence bag, its weight far heavier than paper should ever be. And as the night deepened, Chicago Memorial settled into that uneasy quiet that only hospitals know, where machines hummed steadily and footsteps echoed just a little too loudly down long corridors. Peter was transferred to a private ICU room under layers of security, his condition officially listed as stable but critical, and Raina followed without asking permission, because at this point, asking felt pointless. His eyes were fully bandaged now, thick gauze wrapped carefully after the ophthalmologist explained the corneal abrasions in clipped, clinical terms: temporary blindness if all went well, permanent damage if it didn't, and Raina absorbed the information with the same calm she always used, even as the word blind lodged somewhere deep and refused to move. She adjusted his IV, checked his vitals, documented every change with meticulous care, and learned quickly how to time her rounds so the guards at the door barely noticed her passing, treating her like background noise instead of a woman who had just discovered her life had been quietly watched. The room was dim, lights lowered, curtains half drawn, and Peter lay motionless except for the steady rise and fall of his chest, a man stripped of power, wealth, and control, reduced to breath and blood and machines that didn't care who he was outside these walls. Hours passed like that, Raina sitting beside him between rounds, pretending to review charts while her thoughts refused to settle. She watched his face in the low light, memorizing it again, noting the lines that hadn't been there 5 years ago, the faint scar near his temple she didn't recognize. And she wondered what kind of life he'd lived without her, what kind of enemies came with the watch on his wrist and the men guarding his door. Sometime after midnight, when the hospital seemed to exhale, Peter stirred, not enough to wake, but enough to pull Raina's attention sharply back to him. His breathing grew uneven, a soft sound escaping his throat, and she leaned closer, instinctively checking his monitors before realizing the machines weren't what had changed. He was speaking. At first, it was barely sound at all, just breath shaped into something like words. But as she listened, his voice grew clearer, rough and strained, nothing like the confident tone she remembered. "Don't," he whispered, the word dragged out, heavy with fear. Raina felt a chill run through her, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. "I'm here," she murmured without thinking, her voice low and steady, the same voice she used with patients who hovered between sleep and waking. "You're safe." He shook his head slightly against the pillow, a restless movement, and whispered again, "They don't stop." Raina frowned, leaning closer, her hand hovering near his arm but not touching. "Who doesn't?" she asked quietly, unsure if he could hear her at all. His mouth moved again, lips dry, words spilling out in fragments that didn't belong together. "The Syndicate," he breathed, the name sounding like a curse rather than a title. And Raina's heart skipped, the photograph in her pocket suddenly burning. "They watch everything," he continued, voice cracking. and she'd never heard fear like this in him, not even on their worst days. Bloodlock, he whispered next, the words slurred together. Can't break it. Can't touch it. Raina swallowed, her nurse's mind cataloging the phrases even as her wife's heart struggled to keep up. What bloodlock? She asked softly, glancing toward the door before leaning back in. Peter's brow furrowed beneath the bandages, and his breathing quickened. It keeps it sealed, he said, frustration creeping into his voice. If they get it, everyone's dead. Raina felt the weight of those words settle heavily, realizing that whatever he had built in the years he was gone had come with a price she'd never imagined. You should have stayed away, he whispered suddenly, and her chest tightened painfully. I tried, he went on, voice breaking. I tried to keep you out of it. Raina closed her eyes for a moment, the realization forming slowly but unmistakably that the silence he'd left her with hadn't been indifference or cruelty, but something far more complicated and far more dangerous. She straightened as his vitals spiked briefly, adjusting medication with practiced calm, speaking to him again in the same even tone. You're not alone, she said, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. He didn't respond, his words fading back into restless murmurs, but the pieces he'd dropped lingered in the air, refusing to be ignored. Syndicate, bloodlock, watching, protecting. Raina sat back, her thoughts racing, the image of him walking out 5 years ago replaying itself with new meaning, the absence suddenly feeling less like abandonment and more like exile. She glanced toward the door again, noting the guards' silhouettes through the glass, their presence no longer reassuring, but suffocating. Sometime later, when the unit quieted further and even the guards' attention dulled, Raina reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, opening the recording app with a quick, practiced motion, setting it face down on the table near the bed. She didn't announce it, didn't make a show of it, just let it run, because something told her that whatever truths lived in this room wouldn't survive daylight if she didn't capture them. Peter stirred again, his voice lower now, almost pleading. If they know, he whispered, they'll move. Raina leaned in, her voice barely audible. Who will? She asked. His lips trembled. Marcus, he said, the name slipping out like an accusation, and her stomach dropped. Before she could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, measured and purposeful, and Raina instinctively leaned back, her hand moving casually to silence the screen on her phone. Through the thin wall, she heard Marcus's voice, calm and controlled, speaking into a phone with practiced ease. No, he said quietly, he's not awake yet. There was a pause, long enough that Raina held her breath. If he recognizes the nurse, Marcus continued, his tone flattening, the plan changes. Another pause, heavier this time. We move to the lethal dose. Raina's eyes snapped to Peter's still form, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure someone would hear it, and in that moment she understood with chilling clarity that the danger Peter had been running from had already found them both. Raina did not sleep after what she heard in the hallway, and by the time the night dissolved into a gray, reluctant morning, the ICU wing felt less like a place of healing and more like contested ground. She washed her face in the staff bathroom, stared at her own reflection under the harsh lights, and reminded herself that panic had no place here because panic led to mistakes, and mistakes got people killed. When she returned to the nurse's station, coffee untouched in her hand, she sensed the shift before she saw it, the way the air tightened again, the way voices changed pitch, the way staff began straightening instinctively as if someone important were approaching. The elevator doors at the end of the corridor opened, and Peter's stepfamily emerged like a coordinated performance, dressed in black and muted gray, expensive coats draped just right, grief carefully arranged for maximum visibility. Raina watched them from a distance, her jaw set, as cameras flashed briefly before being ushered away, and the crying began almost on cue, soft sobs and whispered condolences that didn't quite reach their eyes. At the center of it all was Peter's stepmother, Eleanor Caldwell, her posture rigid, her face composed into something that resembled sorrow if you didn't know how to look closely. She moved with purpose, not toward Peter's room at first, but toward administration, flanked by her son and two attorneys whose expressions suggested they'd already rehearsed this moment. From the nurse's station, Raina could hear fragments of conversation drifting down the hall, words like responsibility, mental capacity, and temporary authority slipping through the hum of hospital noise. Eleanor's voice carried more than the others, calm and controlled, sharpened by years of boardrooms and private negotiations, and Raina felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized this wasn't a visit. It was a takeover. She watched as Eleanor dabbed at dry eyes in front of a hospital board member, speaking just loudly enough to be overheard, saying things like, "We're just so worried about Peter's state of mind," and "He's not capable of making decisions right now," and "Someone has to step in before mistakes are made." Raina tightened her grip on the counter, recognizing the language for what it was, the same kind of language Marcus had used the night before, words that sounded reasonable until you followed them to their conclusion. A nurse beside her whispered, "That's family." And Raina didn't answer because she knew better. Family didn't look at a man fighting for his life and see opportunity, but Eleanor did, and Raina could see it in the way her stepmother never once asked how Peter was doing, never once moved toward his room without an audience. As the morning wore on, pressure built quietly but steadily. Requests were made, then demands. Paperwork appeared where it hadn't existed before, and Raina noticed how administrators began deferring more often, how doctors grew cautious with their words. Eleanor's attorneys pressed for power of attorney, citing Peter's coma and temporary blindness as evidence of incapacity, painting a picture of urgency wrapped in concern. Raina listened from the edge of conversations, filing everything away, her nurse's training telling her to observe before acting, even as anger burned low and constant in her chest. She thought of Peter's whispered fear in the night, of Marcus's calm threat in the hallway, and the pieces began to fit together in a way that made her skin crawl. This wasn't about care. It was about control, and control, she was beginning to understand, could be deadly. When Eleanor finally approached the nurse's station, her expression softened into something almost kind. "You must be the nurse who's been with Peter," she said, extending a hand that Raina didn't take. "We're grateful for your dedication." Raina met her gaze steadily. "I'm assigned to his care," she replied. Eleanor smiled faintly. "That may change," she said. "We're making arrangements to ensure Peter receives appropriate oversight." Raina didn't raise her voice or make a scene. She simply said, "All medical decisions remain with his attending physicians unless legally transferred," and watched Eleanor's smile tighten almost imperceptibly. "Of course," Eleanor said smoothly. "That's why we're here." As she walked away, Raina felt a surge of resolve sharpen into focus. She wasn't just a witness anymore, she was a barrier, and barriers tended to get removed. She moved quickly after that, speaking to the attending, citing hospital protocol, emphasizing Peter's stabilization and the risks of interference, framing every objection in clinical language that couldn't be dismissed as emotional attachment. She used her authority carefully, blocking unsanctioned access, documenting everything twice, making sure every order was verified, every medication cross-checked, aware that one overlooked detail could become the medical mistake Eleanor's side seemed so ready to exploit. The tension in the wing became almost physical, a pressure that sat on everyone's shoulders, and Raina felt eyes on her constantly, some curious, some hostile, some calculating. She ignored them all, focusing on Peter, on keeping him alive long enough to wake up, long enough to speak for himself. By mid-morning, exhaustion crept in despite her adrenaline, but she forced herself to slow down when she reached Peter's room to prepare his IV, because haste, she knew, was the enemy now. She checked the chart, confirmed the order, reached for the saline bag, and froze. Something was wrong. It wasn't obvious at first glance, nothing dramatic, but years of experience made her pause. The seal on the bag looked off, not broken exactly, but tampered with, resealed in a way most people would miss. Raina's heart began to pound, but her face remained calm as she lifted the bag closer, inspecting it carefully, her mind racing through possibilities she didn't want to name. The fluid inside was clear, odorless, indistinguishable from saline, but every instinct she had screamed that this was not what it was supposed to be. She glanced at Peter, at the steady rhythm of the monitor, at the bandages over his eyes, and then toward the door where guards stood chatting quietly, unaware. Slowly, deliberately, Raina lowered the bag, her pulse hammering as the realization settled in that the vultures circling Peter weren't waiting anymore. They had already begun to feed. Raina did not breathe until the poisoned saline bag was no longer in her hands, until it lay sealed inside a biohazard disposal pouch beneath the sink, hidden among discarded gloves and tubing where no one would think to look twice. And only then did the reality of what she had almost allowed to happen crash into her chest with such force that her knees nearly buckled, because this was no longer about suspicious relatives or whispered threats in hallways, but about a coordinated attempt to end Peter Hale's life under the cover of sterile professionalism and hospital protocol. The room felt different now, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening, and Raina forced her face into the calm neutrality she had perfected over years of nursing, the mask that hid panic behind competence, as she hung a fresh saline bag and triple-checked the seal, the expiration date, the lot number, every tiny printed detail that could later save her life if someone accused her of imagining things. Peter lay motionless beneath the thin hospital sheet, his chest rising and falling in a slow, mechanical rhythm, guided by machines that beeped softly in the darkened room, his eyes still wrapped in thick white bandages, his world reduced to sound and pain and whatever half-remembered dreams his drugged mind allowed him to keep. And for a moment, Raina simply stood there, watching him, memorizing the familiar curve of his mouth, the faint scar near his jaw that she used to trace with her thumb when they couldn't sleep. She checked the monitors again, not because they needed checking, but because touching something clinical grounded her, reminded her that she still had authority here, that she was not just a woman reliving the wreckage of a marriage that had never been properly buried. Outside the room, she heard the shuffle of shoes and the low murmur of voices as the guards switched shifts, the sound echoing down the corridor like a countdown, and Raina knew this was the narrow window she had been waiting for, the fragile gap between observation and vulnerability, where truth could slip through without being noticed. She moved closer to the bed, her footsteps careful, deliberate, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might register on the machines. And when she leaned down toward Peter's face, the familiar scent of antiseptic and something unmistakably him, wood, rain, the ghost of an expensive cologne, hit her with such intensity that her vision blurred. For 5 years she had practiced not saying his name, had trained her mouth to forget the shape of it, the weight of it, because names had power, and Peter's had once ruled her entire life. But now, with death circling him like a patient predator, silence felt like betrayal. "Peter," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath, a sound meant only for him and the shadows between them. The reaction was immediate and devastating. His breathing stuttered, the smooth rhythm breaking as if he had tripped over something unseen, and his head turned sharply toward the sound, blindfolded eyes straining beneath the bandages, his expression shifting from drugged emptiness to something raw and achingly alive, something that looked dangerously like hope. His fingers twitched, then lifted slowly from the mattress, shaking as if the effort alone cost him more strength than he possessed, and Raina froze, torn between instinct and protocol, knowing she should step back, knowing she should call for a doctor, and yet unable to move as his hand reached out into the space between them. "Raina," he whispered hoarsely, her name broken, uncertain, as if he was afraid it might vanish if he said it too clearly. Her throat closed, emotion surging so fast and hard that it felt like pain, and before she could stop herself, she caught his hand in hers, her fingers wrapping around his with a familiarity that had never truly left them, even after years of absence and unanswered questions. The moment their skin touched, something shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, as if his body recognized her before his mind could catch up, and his grip tightened weakly, anchoring himself to her presence like a man afraid of drowning. "You're not supposed to be here," he murmured, fear threading through his voice now, sharp and urgent despite the drugs, and Raina realized with a chill that even half-conscious and blind, Peter was still calculating danger, still protecting. "I'm here," she replied softly, choosing truth over explanations, because explanations could wait and time could not. "And someone tried to kill you this morning." His hand stiffened, fingers curling around hers with surprising strength, and for a moment he said nothing, as if confirming something he had already known, something that had haunted him long before the hospital bed and the bandages. "The bag," he whispered, his lips barely moving. They wouldn't stop at threats. Raina swallowed hard, leaning closer so no sound would carry beyond the bed, aware of how thin the barrier was between them and the outside world. "I changed it," she said, steady despite the tremor in her chest. "But this isn't random, Peter. This is organized." A faint, humorless breath escaped him. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "It always is." She hesitated, then reached beneath her scrubs, pulling free the thin chain she wore around her neck, the metal cool against her skin, and as she guided his trembling fingers toward it, his hand brushed the ring hanging there, the simple gold band he had placed on her finger so many years ago with a promise he believed had been broken. His breath caught sharply, and his thumb traced the edge of the ring as if committing it to memory, as if the confirmation mattered more than anything else she could have said. "You kept it," he whispered, awe and pain tangled together. "After everything. I never stopped being your wife," she said quietly, the truth heavier than any accusation. "You just stopped letting me stand beside you." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken history, with nights apart and secrets buried so deep they had nearly suffocated them both. And when Peter finally spoke again, his voice was lower, stripped of pretense. "The bloodlock," he said, and Raina felt her pulse spike at the words she had heard him murmur in fevered delirium the night before. "It's not what they think." She leaned in, every sense sharpened. "Then tell me what it is." He took a shallow breath, choosing his words carefully. "They're looking for a code, a key, something they can steal or force out of me, but there is no number, no algorithm, no digital switch they can hack." Her fingers tightened around his hand as understanding began to dawn, slow and terrifying. "It's a trust," he continued, "a legal construct older than the companies, older than the money, designed to survive betrayal from within, and it requires 2 biological signatures to activate or dissolve." Raina's heart thundered, each beat echoing in her ears. "2. Mine," he said, "and yours." The weight of it settled over her like gravity, pulling every piece of the past into a new and devastating alignment. And suddenly, his disappearance, his cold distance, his refusal to explain, all of it took on a horrifying clarity. "I kept you away," he whispered, shame roughening his voice, "because once they knew about you, really knew what you meant to me, you became leverage, and I couldn't let them touch you, couldn't let them corrupt you or worse." Tears burned behind Raina's eyes, but she refused to let them fall, refused to give fear the satisfaction. "By saving your life," she said, voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I walked straight back into it." "Yes," Peter admitted softly. "Honesty his only defense now, and that means they'll come faster." As if summoned by his words, the distant hum of the hospital shifted, lights flickering once, then again casting brief, stuttering shadows across the walls, and Raina straightened instinctively, every nerve on edge. A low alarm sounded, not the shrill panic of cardiac arrest, but something deeper, more systemic. And seconds later, a mechanical voice echoed through the corridor, calm and emotionless. "Attention all staff and patients," it announced. "This facility is now under total lockdown due to a biohazard contamination alert." Red emergency lights flooded the hallway outside, their glow seeping beneath the door like blood, and Raina felt Peter's grip tighten once more, his body going rigid beneath the sheets. "That's not real," he said immediately, certainty cutting through the haze of drugs. "They're sealing the exits." Raina moved quickly now, checking the door, the monitors, the IV line, her mind racing through protocols and escape routes, through allies and enemies, knowing that in a lockdown, no one left, no one entered, and oversight became dangerously easy to manipulate. From the hallway came the heavy sound of doors locking one by one, the click of electronic seals engaging, and somewhere nearby a scream cut off abruptly, sending a chill down Raina's spine. She looked back at Peter, blind but unbroken, and understood with terrifying clarity that the truth had finally surfaced, and with it, the most dangerous night of their lives had truly begun. The red emergency light still cast an eerie glow across Peter's hospital room when Raina realized there was no time left for hesitation. The lockdown was no mistake. It was precise, deliberate, a trap designed by someone who knew the building as well as she did. Every thought of caution, every instinct honed from years of hospital experience, screamed that the danger was not just outside the room. It had infiltrated every door, every corridor, every monitor, every second that passed, ticking louder than any alarm. She leaned over Peter, still blindfolded, his breathing shallow but steady, and gently disconnected him from the heavy, immovable monitors that had become both his lifeline and his prison. Her hands moved quickly, confidently, yet trembled slightly at the weight of the knowledge that one mistake could cost him everything. "Stay with me," she whispered, brushing a damp strand of hair from his forehead. "I'm not letting anyone touch you." Peter's fingers twitched in acknowledgement, weak but deliberate, and Raina felt the fragile connection between them solidify once more. The blindfold hid his eyes, but she knew he trusted her. He had no other choice, and perhaps that was enough for now. She grabbed a wheelchair from the corner, maneuvering him into it with the care of someone moving glass, and cast a quick glance toward the hallway. Guards and security cameras would be scanning every inch for unauthorized movement, yet she had memorized every blind spot in the ICU during her long nights of vigilance. If she moved carefully, silently, and with purpose, they could disappear before anyone even realized the patient was gone. She took a deep breath and wheeled Peter toward the service elevator tucked at the far end, the one usually reserved for laundry carts and maintenance staff. Its metal door groaned as she pressed the call button, each vibration echoing like a warning in the tense silence. The elevator descended slowly, the cage rattling against the shaft as if protesting their escape. Pipes hummed and groaned overhead, carrying steam that curled through the air like smoke in a battlefield, and Raina moved her hand across Peter's arm to reassure him, even as her mind mapped every step of the tunnels below. "Almost there," she said softly. "Just a little further. I've got you." Peter's breathing hitched. He let her words anchor him as he gripped her hand, like it was the only solid thing in a world gone upside down. The darkness around them was total, punctuated only by the dim emergency bulbs blinking faintly, the smell of damp concrete and rust filling their senses. But Raina's memory of the hospital's hidden pathways was enough. Every turn, every stair, every corridor had been memorized during her years of late-night duties. and now those hours of familiarization became a lifeline. As they descended into the underground corridors, the first sounds of pursuit reached them. Muffled footsteps echoing across metal floors, the scrape of wheels against uneven concrete, the occasional clang of a pipe rattled by distant movement. Raina's heart thumped, not just from fear, but from the clarity of purpose. Every step could be the difference between life and death. She guided Peter through the winding passages, careful to avoid shadows that might betray them, careful to time each movement to the muffled rhythm of footsteps above. Peter's fingers tightened around hers. "Raina, I remember," he rasped, his voice raspy from disuse. "The accident. It wasn't an accident. Marcus, he cut the brakes. It was meant to—" His words choked off, but she understood. She had known Marcus for what he was capable of, but hearing Peter admit it brought a new weight to the danger they faced. Raina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the wheelchair through a narrow stairwell, the faint hum of city traffic above, reminding her that they were still inside a cage of steel and concrete. "I know," she whispered, leaning close so he could hear. "I'll protect you. I promise." Peter's head tilted toward her, still blindfolded, as if the sound of her voice was enough to anchor him to reality in the chaos that surrounded them. Hours seemed to compress as they navigated the steam-filled corridors. Raina led Peter past old maintenance rooms, discarded carts, and exposed piping, always alert to the sounds that betrayed pursuit. Occasionally, a distant voice would echo, a question asked too late or a footstep too loud, and she would freeze, heart hammering, listening for the signal to move again. Each sound was a potential ambush, each shadow a possible threat. Peter's blurred vision began returning in flashes of light and shadow. The faint outline of pipes and walls would form only to dissolve again as he struggled to reconcile what his eyes now tried to see. Yet even in this state, he held her hand as though letting go would mean plunging into the abyss. Finally, they emerged from the final corridor into the underground loading dock. The chill of the Chicago morning hit them like a slap, cutting through the sweat and tension, the air carrying the scent of asphalt, diesel, and iron. Raina's eyes scanned the area immediately, taking in the line of black SUVs parked in formation, engines humming low, tires shining wet from the sleet outside. Her breath caught. There was no way past them, no unnoticed alley or shadowed opening to exploit. The dock, once a place for deliveries, had become a trap. Her mind raced through every possible escape route, every plan she had learned in emergency drills, but none applied here. None guaranteed survival. Before Raina could formulate a response, movement drew her gaze to the lead vehicle. Marcus stepped out with deliberate calm, a silenced pistol raised, his posture that of a man who knew he had the upper hand. "Give us the signature, Raina," he said, voice steady, almost cordial, "or the donor and the patient both die tonight." Her stomach sank, but her face remained composed, every line of her body controlled, every breath measured. This was the confrontation she had anticipated but hoped would never come, the ultimate test of courage, skill, and resolve. Peter's hands trembled, not from fear but from recognition of the danger closing around them, and he whispered, They can't have it." Raina tightened her grip on his hand. "Not if I can help it," she whispered back. Her mind scanned the dock again, noting the SUV's positions, the limited cover, the proximity of escape routes, the loading bay doors, the concrete pillars, anything that could give them an advantage. Marcus shifted slightly, the pistol steady, his eyes cold and calculating. Raina's pulse raced, but her mind was clearer than it had been in years. Adrenaline focused her vision, her thoughts, her every movement. "You don't understand," Marcus continued, voice sharp now. "Every second you delay, every move you make costs lives. One false step and—" He didn't finish, the threat hanging in the air, heavy and precise. Raina glanced at Peter again, his blindfolded eyes catching the faint ambient light, his hand still locked in hers, the trust and desperation tangible. "Stay calm," she muttered under her breath, more to herself than him, but he heard it, and for a moment, the trembling slowed, the chaos in the dock frozen between heartbeats. The first of the SUV's doors creaked slightly as someone else moved inside. Marcus's gaze flicked toward it, irritation flashing briefly. Raina used the moment to step slightly, guiding Peter toward the nearest pillar, using the shadows to break the line of sight. Every step was calculated, careful, deliberate, yet even this small movement carried risk. Above the engine hum and the dripping water from the ceiling, Raina heard the faint click of a walkie-talkie, the voice of someone coordinating, though muffled, and distorted. Marcus's words had drawn reinforcements, and the trap had fully sprung. She realized then that no one else in the hospital could intervene quickly. Any delay meant death. The knowledge sharpened her focus, her movements becoming instinctive as she whispered plans to Peter in low tones, moving with him as one unit through the shadows, her mind running through contingencies that included distraction, misdirection, and sheer courage. Marcus's voice cut through the air again, cold and deliberate. "We know you're there. Move toward the signature, now." His pistol didn't waver. The tension in the dock was palpable, electric. Every muscle in Raina's body coiled, her instincts screaming that a single wrong decision would be final. She moved Peter behind the next pillar, crouched low, her eyes scanning for anything to give them leverage, when a loud metallic clang echoed across the concrete, causing both her and Peter to freeze. The echo carried down the dock, drawing attention from the SUV's occupants. Marcus's head snapped toward the sound, and for a heartbeat, Raina saw the slightest flicker of uncertainty. A plan began forming in her mind, not yet complete but emerging from instinct, experience, and desperation. She whispered quickly into Peter's ear, "Trust me, stay low, and when I say, go, move." He nodded slightly, his hand tightening around hers again, and in that tense moment, the night in the tunnels, the poisoned IV bag, and the years of absence all condensed into a single, fragile line between life and death. A shadow moved near the far end of the dock, silhouetted against the morning light filtering through the garage doors. Raina's heart raced, and she realized the specialist they had feared was closer than they had imagined. Marcus's pistol was unwavering, his patience thinning, and every second now counted as a whisper of strategy, a pause, a breath, a heartbeat that could determine the outcome. From the corner of her eye, she spotted a ladder leading to an emergency exit not blocked by SUVs. It was a risk, yes, and the timing had to be perfect, but it was their only chance. She leaned close to Peter, whispering, 3 steps, then run. Do not look back. Do you understand?" He nodded, lips tight around the word, the fear in his eyes mingled with determination. Marcus stepped forward slightly, his voice sharper now, commanding and precise. "One move, Raina," and he didn't finish, because she already moved, shifting Peter into position for their escape, muscles coiled, minds synchronized, the dock becoming a battlefield of shadows and silence, where every decision was life or death, and the night was far from over. The specialist was watching. Marcus was waiting, and Raina, heart pounding, nerves stretched taut, knew that the next second could change everything. The ladder loomed ahead just a few feet away, but the sound of footsteps multiplied behind them, echoing through the concrete corridors. Their pursuers had anticipated this move, and Raina realized with a cold certainty that someone had beaten them to the exit, and the next choice could cost them everything. 7. Raina stood in the cold fluorescent glare of the underground dock, her body a shield between Peter and the line of black SUVs, her hand steady but her heart hammering like a war drum. Marcus's silenced pistol gleamed under the dim lights, his posture rigid with impatience and menace, But Raina's mind raced faster than the bullets could ever fly. She had anticipated this moment down to the tiniest second, and she had already set their salvation into motion without him realizing it. "Peter," she whispered, leaning close so only he could hear, "I'm going to need you to trust me. Every second counts." His eyes, partially recovered from the darkness, flickered with recognition and fear, the raw vulnerability of a man who had been blind, literally and metaphorically, for too long. "Raina, what are you doing?" he rasped, voice shaky from the drugs, from exhaustion, from months of betrayal and isolation. She squeezed his hand, letting him feel the unbroken thread of connection between them, the lifeline that had never truly severed. "I've already started," she said, a faint smirk of grim determination crossing her face. "Everything you see here, Marcus, every step you think you control, is already being watched." Marcus tilted his head, uncertainty flashing for just a moment, imperceptible if not for Raina's trained eyes. That moment was all she needed. She had live-streamed their entire tunnel escape, every confrontation, every step toward this point, directly to Peter's board of directors and the city police. Every subtle maneuver, every illicit threat, every word Marcus had spoken had been transmitted live, uncut, uneditable, and untouchable. She had weaponized the truth, and now it was about to strike with surgical precision. "Show me the signature," Marcus demanded, his voice sharp, the cold calm replaced by tension now that he realized the room was no longer private. "Do it now, or—" His threat froze in the air as the first siren wailed in the distance, shrill, insistent, growing louder by the second. Raina didn't flinch. Her expression remained cold, calculated, a mirror of the resolve that had carried her through years of emotional turmoil and physical danger. She was no longer just a nurse or a witness. She was a force that Marcus had underestimated, a woman who had been underestimated for 5 long years and had waited precisely for this moment to reclaim control. Peter's vision cleared further, enough to see Marcus's face pale as the reality of exposure finally sank in. The smug, self-assured expression that had marked every move Marcus made cracked, replaced by the flash of fear that comes when a predator realizes its prey has claws. How, he muttered, words broken by panic. Raina stepped closer, her eyes locked on his, unyielding. "You should have counted the seconds differently," she said softly, but every syllable carried a weight heavier than a pistol. "You didn't account for me." The first squad of city police stormed the dock, flashlights cutting through the shadows, weapons drawn but aimed for compliance, not aggression. Officers took positions around the SUVs, securing the area while additional squads approached from other exits, ensuring no escape. Marcus's movements became frantic, desperate, every microsecond of hesitation exposing him to the consequences of years of manipulation and greed. Raina watched calmly, breathing measured, every muscle coiled for action, ready to intervene if necessary, though she knew the law was now her ally as much as her cunning. Peter, still gripping her hand, looked at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. You risked yourself?" he asked, the rawness in his voice cutting through the adrenaline-charged air like a knife. "Every second," she replied, her voice low, unwavering. "If I lose you, I lose everything that matters." The meaning was clear, unspoken yet fully understood, and Peter's eyes softened, moisture pooling as he realized the depth of her courage. The police closed in, and the first of Marcus's hired security personnel was detained, the chaos outside their immediate tunnel echoing like a distant storm. Marcus raised his hands, the gun still in his grip, but the weight of exposure, of truth, of law pressed upon him, making each motion slower, more hesitant. Raina moved just slightly, ensuring Peter's wheelchair was between them, her presence both shield and command. "It's over," she said, voice firm, precise, and Marcus's gaze flickered with recognition that he had lost control. The sound of handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the dock, followed by the muffled shouts of Marcus's remaining men as they were neutralized or detained. His step-family, who had arrived with the same smug entitlement that had poisoned every decision and interaction over the years, were now caught in the tide of justice, their plans dissolving in real time as their complicity was broadcasted to both law enforcement and the corporate board. Their expressions turned to panic, shock, disbelief, and then the slow realization that their influence, their greed, their schemes were meaningless. Raina finally allowed herself to exhale, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly as Peter's wheelchair shifted beneath him, his own strength returning. He slowly rose, steadying himself against her hand, his vision fully restored as the adrenaline subsided and clarity returned. He looked at Marcus, at the defeated conspirators, and finally at Raina, the woman who had endured the unendurable, the one who had risked everything for him. All this, for me? He asked, voice breaking, raw emotion visible for the first time in years. She nodded, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. For you, for us, for the truth. You deserved better than what they tried to do to you, Peter. You deserved the chance to come back alive. The words hung in the air, a delicate balance of tenderness and assertion, the kind of statement that only survives when pain and love coexist without compromise. Peter's fingers found hers again, gripping tightly, as if to anchor himself in the new reality she had orchestrated. Then, the blood lock? He asked, curiosity and fear mingling. Raina's eyes met his with unwavering confidence. Never about the money, she said. It was a trap, a dead man's switch, a safeguard you created to protect everyone, including yourself. It was never meant to be understood by them, and it was never theirs to claim. The police began escorting the remaining conspirators away, and the chaos of law enforcement mixed with the faint glow of emergency lights as dawn crept across the dock. Peter finally laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried disbelief and relief, and Raina allowed herself the smallest smile, one that acknowledged survival, justice, and the possibility of beginnings anew. The dismantling of Peter's empire was swift and final. The once billion-dollar corporation, a symbol of ruthless ambition and greed, was converted into a massive healthcare trust for the city's underprivileged, a lasting legacy of protection and service that Peter had long envisioned but could never execute while under siege. He was left with nothing, no fortune, no titles, but with life, love, and a clean slate, things far more valuable than money ever had been. Months passed, the city moving on from the scandal, the arrests, the headlines. But Peter and Raina did not rush. They spent quiet days repairing the fracture of trust, rediscovering the intimacy and connection that had once defined them, and slowly, deliberately building a life together that was theirs alone. 6 months later, Peter walked into Raina's modest neighborhood clinic. No tycoon, no empire, just a man carrying a single rose in his hand, eyes scanning the familiar space before resting on her. She looked up from the paperwork she was reviewing, her face lighting with recognition, and a smile slowly spread as he approached. "Do you believe in second chances?" he asked, holding out the rose, his voice filled with sincerity, hope, and the vulnerability that had once defined their relationship. Raina accepted the rose, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and nodded. "I do," she said softly, her voice carrying both reassurance and a promise of enduring partnership. Just as she leaned forward to close the distance between them, a man in a gray suit across the street snapped a photograph, a subtle but unmistakable signal as he whispered into a radio, "Subject 1 is active. Initiate phase 2. Raina's gaze hardened slightly, awareness sharpening. The world may have been calm for now, but threats lingered. shadows never fully disappearing. Yet in that moment, with Peter by her side, with the rose in her hand, she allowed herself to breathe, to hope, and to reclaim a life that had been stolen and returned with purpose. Peter slipped his hand into hers, fingers intertwining naturally, and whispered, "This time, we stay together, no matter what." She smiled, leaning into him, the warmth of human connection, survival and love finally piercing through the years of fear and separation. Outside, the city moved on, but inside, their story, scarred, tested, and now resilient, had reached a chapter of quiet triumph. And yet, across the street, the faint hum of a car engine, the shadowed figure in the gray suit, and the whispered command reminded them both: life, much like love, is never without its dangers, but together they were prepared to face them. And that's the incredible journey of Raina and Peter, a story of love lost, courage tested, and secrets revealed. Did you feel every heartbeat, every fear, every choice they made? I want to know, what would you have done in their place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from Heart-Woven Tales. Remember, every ending is just the beginning, and the next tale is waiting. Until then, stay brave, stay curious, and keep your heart wide open.